Joining us now to explain what's actually going on here, Ken Cuccinelli is the national chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative. You know him as the former Virginia Attorney General and as the acting Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security previously. Sir, good to have you back with us.
Good to be with you.
The cartels, at least because they have relationships with the New York Times, apparently, are saying, it's not a good time for us.
Yeah, well, and the owner of the New York Times is the richest man in Mexico.
True.
Interesting. But we'll see how long it lasts. I mean, how much of this is performative? One of the things that you can't see is, and none of us can, is just how many people at the local, state, and federal level are effectively in bed with the cartels. So it's entirely plausible that a lot of those folks could have just gone to the cartels and said, hey, we have to make our biggest push ever. You guys just have to absorb this punch. But don't worry, this too shall pass, as it has for decades. And we'll get back to normal later. Well, we'll see.
So in other words, this
is a good
kind of
start, though.
In other words, this could be kind of a Mexican deep state piece of propaganda, which is that we're pretending that the cartels are being brought under control.
Si, senor.
Si.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting.
It could, and we are, only time will tell, really, because we don't have a ton of intel on what goes on in Mexico, and including the cartels.
Yeah.
We focused our intel efforts for the last 25 years on the Middle East and Africa, to the great detriment of the Western Hemisphere, including our own neighbors here. And it's important for people to realize that the Mexican government doesn't control a third of Mexico. A sixth of Mexico is absolutely under the control of these cartels, and another sixth is sort of disputed in various degrees between the cartels and the Mexican state and federal governments. And so they don't have a cohesive country like we do in the United States.
So, Ken, how much power does China wield over this conversation? Because, when we look at the fentanyl supply chain, China is the critical resource from which all of those precursor chemicals are coming. They're selling the equipment that's used to press this fentanyl into pills in Mexico. They have the cartels, as I understand it. Peter Schweitzer wrote a whole book on this subject. They're using encrypted Chinese apps to conduct their operations. It does seem like China is kind of controlling a lot of this.
Well, I wouldn't say controlling. They're definitely benefiting from it from a strategic standpoint. All of this, the cheaper drugs are, the worse off America is. Let's not forget that if Americans just stopped buying illegal drugs, these folks, and now with a closed border with President Trump, these folks would dry up.
Well, sure,
Biden,
but if I can, I'm sorry, just on that point, in my understanding, a lot of the deaths now are from recreational drug consumption, albeit not appropriate, not prescribed, but people are taking things that they don't realize are fentanyl.
Right, or fentanyl's in it. For the life of me, I don't know why the fentanyl pushers want to do that. All they do is bring more attention, negative attention, and law enforcement attention, and who knows, soon maybe even military attention down on their head with President Trump. And in his first term, President Trump was very determined to drive that fentanyl death number down, and he did. He did. It was still unacceptably high, but he drove it downward instead of seeing it go up as it did under Biden.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think he's willing to take some steps against the cartels that are going to make that even more difficult for the cartels to stay organized and move shipments into this country. But to the China point, they make money off it. Strategically, they benefit from our weakness that results from it. But I wouldn't say they're exercising control over any of the cartels. They're just happy beneficiaries, and they want to both keep it that way and not be seen doing it.
Yeah, well, they're like the world's biggest enablers, at least, which is what's happening right now. So the cartels, how dangerous are they? Because I've seen some chatter on the subject. As President Trump contemplates what he's going to do to get the cartels under control. The terror designation, of course, we got early in the administration, and some thought being given to, do we take military action against the cartels? What does that look like should something like that happen, Ken Cuccinelli?
Well, it looks precision like. Look, one of the problems with the cartels and why the foreign terrorist designation is difficult to wield here is that we're used to, that statute was written for Islamic cells that were trying to hide and keep to themselves. These folks literally are the governments in their communities. They are running the communities and controlling the communities in their parts of Mexico. That is really not what these statutes were written for. We need to get at the money, and I think we need a new statute. I've talked to several senators about this. We need a new statute that gives more monetary authority to literally hack these folks' accounts and get after their assets. Because unlike those Islamic jihadists who are, want to topple the Western civilization, the drug cartels, they just want money. They're just after money. They'll use terrorist tactics to get it, and they have. But their goal is money, and we need to attack the money. And that's a little bit different than attacking Islamic terror cells.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the intel in place, as I already mentioned. We need to build up our intel capacity with respect to these cartels so we can, we wouldn't say it on the radio, of course, but so that the question can be intelligently answered. If we're going to do one thing militarily, what's the most valuable from both a success, impact, and safety from avoiding collateral damage standpoint?
So there's
a lot to think about there.
There's a lot to consider. You want to do this as safely and efficiently as possible. The New York Times had a report, not an additional report. This is now about half a month ago, and the headline was "CIA expands secret drone flights over Mexico." I'm sitting here going, "Well, it's not a secret anymore, is it?" I mean, it's published in the New York Times. And of course, this was credited to anonymous sources who are sharing with the New York Times this classified information, assuming that it's true, that we have these drone flights going over the cartels. It seems like President Trump has people who are still within the deep state here in the United States who are working to subvert this obviously noble mission to save American lives.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to think of a reason to defend the cartels, even in the context of America's deep state battles. I will tell you, though, that when I was in this fight, the existing terror-focused military-industrial complex had no interest in the Western Hemisphere. They wanted to be fighting and observing and spying over in the Middle East and in Africa and Greater Asia. They wanted to be getting after those opponents. They just didn't care about the cartels. The intelligence community, including the military side of it, is not very interested in this target. Now, the president gets to decide,
yes,
but in the first term, he did not impose those priorities on those institutions. And now he comes in with a whole lot more energy and determination on this front. And I think a lot of them are going to fall into line. That doesn't mean there aren't going to be leakers. And as you point out, that's both unpatriotic and dangerous information to leak. But this administration has also shown a willingness to run those to ground and to bring those consequences to those folks.
Also, as for normal Americans, they look at this and they say, well, this is a direct American interest. It's not in any way some sort of abstract way to connect why Americans should be concerned about it. It's literally our border. It's literally the terror groups that are south of it, and it's killing over 100,000 Americans a year. I don't know if it's even possible to more obviously do the math on what our enemies are.
Yeah, it's a lot harder. It takes a lot more connecting the dots to explain why we've expended 100 or 200 billion in Ukraine than it does why we would pay attention to securing our border and actively taking on the cartels, who, as you note, they're killing more people every year than we lost in the whole war in Vietnam,
Yes.
every single year. And through drug overdose deaths and so forth.
Yep.
They're also running human trafficking rings, including sex trafficking and labor trafficking. There was probably a point in the Biden administration, there were probably several years, where they made more money trafficking people than drugs. Part of the reason was drugs got so cheap because of the open border. And, for those listening, ask cops about the street price of these drugs and what happened to them in the last 5 years and what's happening to them right now. It tells the tale.
Yes.
There are no regulations other than who can catch who on the supply and demand of illegal drugs.
The street price is such an interesting and important piece of data because remember the Biden administration would constantly tell us, "Oh, we've captured even more fentanyl coming through ports of crossing," and they would basically use that as a way to say that they're catching all the fentanyl, which of course they weren't. It's the street price, it's the market forces that really tell you the story.
Right. Absolutely, and that's true regardless of administrations. Everybody wants to look good, right? They pile up the drugs, take a picture, and shoot it out on Twitter. But the fact of the matter is, what does it cost a user to use? And the higher that cost, the less users there are going to be. And the ones that are out there are going to use less. It's just math, Vince. It's just math. And that means less people will die.
Yep.
And it means the cartels are going to make less money, buy less military equipment, destabilize the rest of the Western Hemisphere, including Mexico, less and less. And all of this, where we started our discussion here, is now for the first time seeing some effort on the part of Mexico. Even when Mexico cooperated in the first Trump administration on the immigration front, they never went after the cartels. They never challenged the cartels. There was never a serious effort. What we're seeing now could be the beginning of a sustained effort, but understand the politics of Mexico. This is the second administration in a row, and she's just in the beginning of her 6-year presidency. She is a continuation of AMLO, her predecessor. Some people think she's a puppet of her predecessor, much like people said of Biden via Obama. And they have vehemently, if you can believe that, they have vehemently opposed taking on the cartels. So I'll believe it when I see this sustained for a while. I'll believe it when I start seeing Mexican government officials prosecuted for corruption and working with the cartels.
Yeah.
That'll be the real sign that they're taking this on a long-term basis.
Yep.
And look, if I'm a Mexican, I want my government to control my country. As a simple matter of patriotism and pride, not to mention security and safety for me, my family, my children, and my country.
And for the economy, by the way, because starting tonight, 25% tariff on Mexico because President Trump is right there with you. He doubts they're going to get it under control unless we take some really drastic measures. So that's coming. Hey, Ken Cuccinelli, as always, thank you for your service to your country and your time today. Good to talk to you.